What if I told you that one woman's DNA literally destroyed 3 empires and killed at least 9 members of European royalty? What if I told you that this woman was considered the most powerful monarch of her time, and she had absolutely no idea she was carrying a genetic time bomb that would change the course of world history forever? I'm talking about Queen Victoria of England, the grandmother of Europe, who unknowingly carried a mutation so deadly that it would kill her own son, her grandsons, and help trigger the Russian Revolution that murdered an entire royal family. This isn't just a story about a genetic disease. This is a story about how one tiny mutation in one woman's DNA spread like a plague through Europe's royal families, causing unimaginable suffering, political chaos, and literally toppling thrones. If you think Game of Thrones was dramatic, wait until you hear what actually happened in real royal families. So hit that like button, subscribe right now, because what I'm about to reveal is the darkest secret in European royal history, and trust me, this story will absolutely blow your mind. Let's start in 1819, when a baby girl was born in Kensington Palace in London. Her name was Alexandrina Victoria, and absolutely nobody expected her to become queen. She was 5th in line to the throne, and in those days, that basically meant you had no chance. But fate works in mysterious ways, and one by one, everyone ahead of her in line died. Her grandfather, King George III, went insane and died. Her uncle, King George IV, died without legitimate children. Another uncle, King William IV, also died childless. By 1837, when Victoria was just 18 years old, she became Queen of the United Kingdom. Can you imagine an 18-year-old girl suddenly ruling the most powerful empire on earth? But here's the thing nobody knew at the time. Inside Victoria's cells, in her DNA, there was a mutation, one single genetic error on her X chromosome. This mutation affected a gene called F9, which is responsible for producing a protein that helps blood clot. Without this protein working properly, blood cannot form clots to stop bleeding. This condition is called hemophilia B, also known as Christmas disease, and it's one of the rarest and most severe forms of hemophilia that exists. Now here's where it gets absolutely fascinating and terrifying. Victoria had no family history of hemophilia. Her parents didn't have it. Her grandparents didn't have it. So where did this mutation come from? Scientists believe it was a spontaneous mutation, meaning it just randomly appeared in Victoria's DNA, probably when she was conceived. Think about that for a second. One random genetic accident, one moment of chance during conception, and the entire future of Europe was altered forever. It's like rolling cosmic dice that ended up killing dozens of people and changing world history. But Victoria herself never showed any symptoms because hemophilia is what's called an X-linked recessive disorder. Women have 2 X chromosomes, so even if one carries the mutation, the other healthy one can compensate. But men only have 1 X chromosome. If they inherit the mutated one from their mother, they have no backup. They develop the full disease. And here's the cruel mathematics of genetics. If a woman is a carrier like Victoria, each of her sons has a 50% chance of having hemophilia, and each of her daughters has a 50% chance of being a carrier who will pass it to their children. Victoria married her cousin Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in 1840, and together they had 9 children. 9 children who would marry into virtually every royal family in Europe, earning Victoria the nickname Grandmother of Europe. It sounds sweet, right? Like she was spreading love and family connections across the continent. But what she was actually spreading was a genetic nightmare that would haunt European royalty for generations. Her children married into the royal families of Germany, Russia, Spain, Romania, Sweden, Norway, and Greece. It seemed like a brilliant political strategy at the time, creating alliances and preventing wars by intermarrying royal families. But what nobody realized was that they were creating the perfect conditions for a genetic disaster. They were creating a genetic bottleneck, where the same mutated gene would be passed back and forth between related families, concentrating the disease and making it impossible to escape. The first sign that something was wrong came with Victoria's eighth child, Prince Leopold, born in 1853. From the time he was an infant, Leopold had mysterious bleeding episodes. He would bruise from the slightest touch. A small cut would bleed for days. When he was a toddler and fell down, he would develop massive internal hemorrhaging that would leave him bedridden for weeks, sometimes months. The royal doctors were baffled. They had never seen anything like this before. They didn't understand what was happening to this poor child. Remember, this was the 1850s. Genetics hadn't been discovered yet. Nobody understood DNA or chromosomes or hereditary diseases. The doctors just knew that this royal prince was mysteriously fragile, that his blood wouldn't stop flowing once it started, and that every single day of his life was potentially his last. Victoria watched her son suffer for his entire childhood. She described him as her dear, gentle, invalid child. Leopold couldn't play rough like other boys. He couldn't participate in sports. He couldn't do normal activities because any injury could kill him. Can you imagine being a child and knowing that a simple playground accident could cause you to bleed to death? Can you imagine being a mother and watching your child live in constant fear and pain? But Victoria still didn't understand that she was the source of the disease. She had no way of knowing. The concept of genetic inheritance wasn't understood yet. She just thought Leopold was unlucky, that he had some mysterious weakness. She never imagined that the problem was literally written in her own DNA, and that she had already passed it to other children who would pass it forward through generations. Leopold managed to survive to adulthood, which was actually remarkable for a hemophiliac in the 19th century. He attended Oxford University, became quite cultured and intelligent, and in 1882 he married Princess Helena of Waldeck and Piedmont. They had 2 children, a daughter named Alice and a son named Charles Edward, born posthumously because Leopold died before his son was born. How did Leopold die? In 1884, when he was just 30 years old, Leopold slipped and fell while on vacation in Cannes, France. Just a simple fall. The kind of accident that happens to people every single day. But for Leopold, it triggered a cerebral hemorrhage, bleeding in his brain. He died hours later, leaving behind a pregnant wife and a young daughter. And here's the tragic irony. His son Charles Edward couldn't inherit hemophilia because fathers pass their Y chromosome to sons, not their X chromosome. But his daughter Alice was a guaranteed carrier because she had to inherit her father's only X chromosome, which carried the mutation. But Leopold wasn't the only child Victoria passed the gene to. 2 of her daughters, Princess Alice and Princess Beatrice, were also carriers, even though they showed no symptoms themselves. And this is where the disease really started spreading like wildfire through European royalty. Princess Alice, Victoria's 3rd child, married the Grand Duke Louis IV of Hesse in Germany in 1862. They had 7 children together, and the hemophilia gene appeared in devastating ways. One of her sons, Prince Friedrich, known as Fritty in the family, was diagnosed with hemophilia when he was just 2.5 years old. In May 1873, Fritty was playing in his mother's bedroom at their palace with his brother. The little boy climbed on a chair to look out the window, trying to see his brother in another room. The chair tipped over, and Fritty fell from the window to the ground below. Because of his hemophilia, the fall caused massive internal bleeding in his brain. The child died in agony bleeding internally while his mother held him, completely helpless to save him. Princess Alice was absolutely devastated. She wrote that watching her son die slowly from internal hemorrhaging was the worst experience of her life. But the tragedy didn't end there. Princess Alice had two daughters who were carriers, Princess Irene and Princess Alex. These two women would carry Queen Victoria's deadly gene into two more royal families. Princess Irene married Prince Henry of Prussia, brother of Kaiser Wilhelm II, and had several children, including at least two sons with hemophilia. But it's Princess Alex, whose story is perhaps the most historically significant and absolutely heartbreaking. Alex, who was Queen Victoria's favorite granddaughter, grew up to become one of the most tragic figures in history. In 1894, she married Nicholas II, who had just become Tsar of Russia. Alex converted to Russian Orthodoxy and took the name Alexandra Fedorovna. They seemed like a fairy tale couple, young, beautiful, deeply in love. They had 4 daughters together between 1895 and 1901. But what they desperately needed was a son, an heir to the Russian throne. Finally, in 1904, after 9 years of marriage and 4 daughters, Alexandra gave birth to a boy, Alexei Nikolaevich Romanov, Tsarevich of Russia, heir to the Russian Empire. The entire nation celebrated. There were festivals, parties, amnesty granted to prisoners, medals distributed, cash rewards given out. Russia finally had an heir. The 300-year-old Romanov dynasty had a future. Except they didn't know what Alexandra knew. They didn't know the secret that was making her sick with dread, even as she held her newborn son. Because Alexandra knew her family history. She knew about Queen Victoria's hemophilia. She knew her own mother, Princess Alice, had been a carrier. She knew she might be a carrier too. And when Alexei was just 6 weeks old, the worst was confirmed. The baby began bleeding uncontrollably from his umbilical cord. The doctors couldn't stop it. They realized with horror that the heir to the Russian throne had hemophilia B, the royal disease, inherited from his great-grandmother Queen Victoria through a chain of carrier women. From that moment on, Alexei's life became a living nightmare, and his disease would ultimately contribute to the downfall of the Russian Empire itself. Think about what it meant to be a hemophiliac child in 1904. There was no treatment. There was no medication. There was nothing doctors could do except watch helplessly as the boy suffered through bleeding episodes. Any small injury, any bump or bruise, could trigger internal hemorrhaging that would last for days or weeks. The pain was described as absolutely excruciating. Blood would seep into Alexei's joints, particularly his knees and elbows, destroying the cartilage and bone. His legs would swell to enormous sizes. He would scream in agony for hours, sometimes days, while his parents sat by his bedside completely helpless. His mother Alexandra would go days without sleeping, sitting with her son as he cried in pain. Court witnesses described the boy's screams echoing through the palace, and staff members having to cover their ears because they couldn't bear to hear the child suffering. The Romanovs desperately tried to keep Alexei's condition secret from the Russian public. They understood that if people knew the heir to the throne had a deadly genetic disease, it would create panic and political instability. So they lied. When Alexei couldn't appear at public events, they claimed he had a cold or the flu. When he couldn't walk because of bleeding in his joints, they said he had hurt his ankle playing. But people at court weren't stupid. They noticed that Tsarevich was always sick. They noticed the royal family became increasingly isolated and paranoid. They noticed Alexandra was constantly anxious and desperate. And then they noticed something even stranger. The royal family had become completely dependent on a mysterious Siberian peasant monk named Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was introduced to the royal family in 1905, shortly after Alexei's diagnosis. He was an illiterate peasant from Siberia with a reputation as a holy man and mystical healer. He was also known for drinking heavily, fighting, and possibly stealing in his past. He was the opposite of what you'd expect to find in the sophisticated Russian court. But Alexandra didn't care about any of that. She cared that Rasputin seemed to be able to help Alexei when the doctors couldn't. And here's where the story gets even more disturbing. Every time Alexei had a severe hemophilia attack, the royal doctors would frantically try to stop the bleeding. They would give the boy aspirin for his pain. But remember, this was the early 1900s. They didn't know that aspirin is an anticoagulant, meaning it prevents blood from clotting. They were literally making the bleeding worse by trying to treat the pain. Then Rasputin would arrive, and his advice was always the same: do not let the doctors bother him too much. Let the child rest. And miraculously, Alexei would start to improve. Was Rasputin actually performing miracles? Almost certainly not. Most historians believe he was simply telling them to stop giving the child aspirin and other medications that were making things worse. He may have also used hypnosis or calming techniques to reduce Alexei's stress and anxiety, which can actually help the body's natural healing process. But Alexandra was convinced Rasputin had been sent by God to save her son. She became absolutely dependent on him, and Rasputin, seeing his power over the royal family, began to manipulate them for political gain. The most famous incident happened in 1912, when the family was vacationing in Poland. 8-year-old Alexei was playing in a boat when he fell and bruised his abdomen. The bruise triggered the worst hemophilia attack he had ever experienced. Internal bleeding filled his abdomen. The pain was so severe that his screams could be heard throughout the palace. His legs became completely paralyzed. For 11 days, the boy hovered at the edge of death. Doctors drew up drafts of his death announcement. Last rites were administered. Alexandra sat by his bed for days without sleeping, convinced she was watching her only son die. In desperation, Alexandra's friend sent a telegram to Rasputin, who was back in Siberia, hundreds of miles away. Rasputin sent back a telegram that said, "God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve. The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much." The next day, completely inexplicably, the bleeding stopped. Alexei began to recover. Was it a miracle? Was it coincidence? Was it simply that the bleeding ran its natural course? Nobody knows for certain. But Alexandra was now absolutely convinced that Rasputin was the only thing keeping her son alive. From that moment on, nothing could shake her faith in him, and Rasputin's influence over the royal family became total. He started making recommendations about government appointments. He started influencing Russian policy. He convinced Nicholas II to take personal command of the Russian army during World War I, even though the Tsar had no military experience. This decision was catastrophic and contributed to Russia's defeats in the war. Meanwhile, the Russian public grew increasingly suspicious and angry. They didn't understand why the Tsar and Tsarina were so isolated. They didn't understand why this strange peasant monk had so much influence. Rumors spread that Rasputin was Alexandra's lover. Other rumors claimed Alexandra was a German spy, which was particularly damaging during World War I, when Russia was fighting Germany. The truth that their son had a deadly genetic disease inherited from Queen Victoria, and they were desperate to keep him alive, was kept secret, and that secrecy helped fuel the revolutionary fervor that would eventually destroy the Romanovs. In 1916, a group of nobles, worried about Rasputin's massive influence and convinced he was destroying Russia, assassinated him. They poisoned him, shot him multiple times, beat him, and threw him in a frozen river. 18 months later, in July 1918, the entire Romanov family, including 13-year-old Alexei, were executed by Bolshevik revolutionaries in a basement in Yekaterinburg. Alexei, who had survived 13 years with severe hemophilia, who had endured unimaginable pain and suffering his entire life, died from bullets alongside his parents and sisters. But Queen Victoria's deadly gene wasn't finished destroying royal families yet. Through her youngest daughter, Princess Beatrice, the gene traveled to Spain. Beatrice had married Prince Henry of Battenberg and had 4 children. At least 2 of her sons, Leopold and possibly Maurice, had hemophilia. Leopold died at age 32 during a hip operation in 1922. Maurice was killed in action during World War I at age 23, and some historians believe his hemophilia may have contributed to his death, though others dispute whether he actually had the disease, since hemophiliacs were typically not allowed in combat. But Beatrice's daughter, Victoria Eugenie, who was known as Ina, carried the gene to Spain when she married King Alfonso XIII in 1906. Alfonso was deeply in love with Ina, and Queen Victoria herself had approved the match before her death. The wedding seemed like a fairy tale, but it turned into a nightmare. Ina and Alfonso had 6 children together, 4 sons and 2 daughters. 2 of their sons, Alfonso Prince of Asturias and Infant Gonzalo, inherited hemophilia. Just like Alexei Romanov, these Spanish princes suffered their entire childhoods with the disease. They couldn't play like normal children. They lived in constant fear of injury. Their parents watched helplessly as they endured bleeding episodes. The situation put enormous strain on the royal marriage. King Alfonso blamed Ina for bringing the disease into his family. He became cold and distant toward her and took multiple mistresses. The Spanish public learned about the heir's disease, and many blamed the foreign queen for weakening the royal bloodline. The political situation in Spain was already unstable in the early 20th century, and the royal family's problems made it worse. In 1931, facing political turmoil, economic crisis, and public discontent, partly fueled by concerns about the sickly heirs, King Alfonso XIII abdicated and went into exile. Spain became a republic. Eventually, this political chaos contributed to the rise of the brutal dictator Francisco Franco, who tormented Spain for decades. You can draw a direct line from Queen Victoria's gene mutation to Franco's dictatorship. That's how far-reaching the consequences of this one genetic accident were. As for the hemophiliac Spanish princes, their fates were tragic. Alfonso, the heir to a throne his father had abandoned, moved to America. In 1938, when he was 31 years old, Alfonso was in Miami, Florida. He had spent the evening at dinner, a movie, and a nightclub with a woman who then drove him back to his hotel. She was blinded by oncoming truck headlights and veered to avoid a collision, but faulty steering caused her to overcompensate and crash into a utility pole. Both appeared to have only minor injuries. But Alfonso's hemophilia meant the minor internal injuries became fatal. He bled internally and died within hours. A simple car accident that anyone else would have walked away from killed him because of a gene mutation from his great-great-great-grandmother. His brother Infant Gonzalo died even younger. In 1934, when he was only 19 years old, Gonzalo was in a car accident in Austria. Just like his brother, the minor injuries from the crash triggered internal bleeding that killed him. 2 brothers, both dead before age 32, both from car accidents that wouldn't have been fatal without hemophilia. And Gonzalo was the last known descendant of Queen Victoria to die from the disease. After him, the royal disease finally burned itself out of European royalty. But before it disappeared, it had killed at least 9 royal males that we know of. Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, Prince Friedrich of Hesse, Prince Leopold Mountbatten, Prince Maurice of Battenberg, Rupert Cambridge, Viscount Tremetton, Tsarevich Alexei of Russia, Alfonso Prince of Asturias, Infant Gonzalo of Spain, and Prince Waldemar of Prussia, who died in 1945. Some historians believe the actual death toll was higher, including other children who died in infancy where hemophilia was suspected but never confirmed. But the disease killed more than just 9 princes. It killed relationships, destroyed marriages, toppled thrones, and contributed to political chaos that reshaped Europe. It brought a fraudulent mystic into the heart of the Russian government, influencing disastrous decisions during World War I. It weakened public confidence in multiple royal families. It spread paranoia and secrecy throughout European courts. And all of this, every single consequence, traces back to one spontaneous mutation in one woman's DNA in 1819. Queen Victoria lived until 1901 and died at age 81, having outlived her son Leopold and her grandson Friedrich, both killed by her genetic legacy. But she never fully understood what she had done. She never understood genetics or chromosomes or DNA mutations. She knew hemophilia was in her family, but she thought it was just bad luck, a curse from God, something mysterious and unexplainable. She never knew that she was patient zero for a genetic plague that would haunt European royalty for generations. Scientists finally figured out exactly what type of hemophilia it was in 2009, when they analyzed DNA from the bones of Tsarevich Alexei and his sister Anastasia, whose remains were discovered near Yekaterinburg. The DNA analysis revealed they had hemophilia B, the rarest and most severe form, caused by a specific mutation in the F9 gene. This mutation creates what's called an abnormal splicing site, which prevents the gene from properly producing factor IX, a crucial protein for blood clotting. Without factor IX, blood simply cannot form clots. Every injury becomes potentially lethal. And this is the mutation Queen Victoria passed to her children and grandchildren. Today, hemophilia B is treatable. Modern medicine can provide factor IX replacement therapy. People with hemophilia can live relatively normal lives with proper treatment. But in Queen Victoria's time, there was nothing. Just pain, suffering, fear, and early death. The story of the royal disease teaches us several profound lessons about genetics, power, and history. First, it shows us how one random genetic accident can have absolutely enormous historical consequences. If Victoria's egg or her father's sperm hadn't had that one mutation, Leopold would have lived normally, Alice and Beatrice wouldn't have been carriers, Alexei wouldn't have suffered, Rasputin wouldn't have gained influence over the Russian court. The Russian Revolution might have unfolded differently, the Spanish monarchy might have remained stable, the entire course of 20th century European history could have been different. One mutation, one accident of biology, and history was forever changed. Second, it reveals the dangers of genetic bottlenecks and inbreeding among royal families. European royalty had been intermarrying for centuries to keep bloodlines pure and maintain power within elite families. But this practice meant that when a harmful mutation appeared, it spread rapidly through the entire interconnected family network. There was no genetic diversity to dilute it. Every marriage between cousins, every strategic alliance between related royals, just concentrated the disease more. Third, it shows the terrible price of secrecy. The Romanovs kept Alexei's disease secret because they feared political instability. But that secrecy led them to rely on Rasputin, which ultimately caused more political damage than honesty would have. It made them isolated and paranoid, cut off from their own people, unable to explain their decisions or behavior. The Spanish royals faced similar problems. When royal families hide the truth, even for understandable reasons, it often backfires catastrophically. Fourth, it demonstrates how far medical understanding has come in just over a century. In Victoria's time, hemophilia was a mysterious death sentence. Today, it's a manageable chronic condition. This gives us hope that other genetic diseases we can't treat today might be treatable in the future. But it also reminds us how recently our ancestors lived in a world where a simple genetic disease meant a lifetime of suffering and early death. And finally, this story reminds us that even the most powerful people in history, even queens and empresses and tsars, were still human beings dealing with the same fears and griefs that any parent faces. Victoria watching Leopold suffer through childhood, Alexandra sitting by Alexei's bed for days as he screamed in pain. Ina being blamed by her husband for something she had no control over. These weren't just historical figures or political actors. They were mothers and fathers watching their children suffer and die, feeling helpless and guilty and desperate. The crown and the throne and the empire couldn't protect them from a microscopic mutation in their DNA. All the power and wealth in the world meant nothing against genetics. So what's Queen Victoria's legacy? She's remembered as a great monarch who ruled during Britain's most powerful era. She's remembered as the grandmother of Europe, who connected royal families across the continent. She's remembered for the Victorian era of progress and industry and cultural achievement. But she should also be remembered as the unwitting source of a genetic catastrophe that killed her descendants and changed European history. She was both victim and vector of a disease she never understood. She loved her children fiercely, but passed them a deadly inheritance. She tried to build a dynasty that would last forever, but built one partially on genetic weakness. Today, no living member of a European reigning royal family is known to have hemophilia or carry the gene. The disease has been bred out of royal lines through marriages outside the old interconnected families and through simple genetic luck. Queen Victoria's great-grandchildren are free of the curse she unknowingly passed forward, but the shadow of the royal disease still looms over European history. Every time we study the fall of the Romanovs, hemophilia is part of the story. Every time we examine the political instability of early 20th century Spain, hemophilia is there in the background. Every time we learn about the dangers of genetic diseases and the importance of genetic diversity, hemophilia in European royalty is used as the classic example. The royal disease, Victoria's disease, the Christmas disease that killed 9 princes and contributed to toppling 3 empires. If this story shocked you, if you learned something you never knew about Queen Victoria and European royalty, then smash that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because there are so many more dark secrets hidden in history that nobody teaches you in school. Share this video with anyone who's interested in royal history or genetics or just crazy historical stories, because I guarantee they don't know this part of Queen Victoria's legacy. Comment below and tell me, were you shocked to learn that one genetic mutation changed so much of European history? Did you know about hemophilia in royal families before this video? I want to hear your thoughts. And remember, history isn't just about kings and queens and battles and empires. Sometimes it's about something as small as a single mutation in a single gene, in a single person that ripples forward through time affecting millions of lives. That's the real lesson of Queen Victoria's deadly gene. One woman's DNA, one random genetic accident, and the fate of empires forever altered. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, where we uncover more shocking historical truths that changed the world.